In this video, I really have no idea what I'm doing. I'm making an object I've never thrown before, although it is one I've used rather a lot at home. A coffee dripper or a pour over, and, as it turns out, an item that requires rather a lot of work if being thrown and trimmed into these sorts of shapes. Coffee is an important thing in my workshop. Usually it's this, a cafetiere full, but it tends to always be a bit of a rushed experience compared to the way I drink coffee at home via a V60 dripper and filters. I want to try and take more meaningful breaks at the workshop, so I purchased another dripper to use here, but then I thought, well, really I should just make my own. So, the throwing and trimming of my first ever batch of those will be what this video is about. This isn't to knock coffee made in a French press. I have quite a particular method of brewing in one of these, but I tend to always make too much, it's very strong, I end up drinking the whole damn thing, and then I spend 2 hours with my hands shaking as I try and trim pots. The final step, after this is brewed for about 4 minutes, is to scrape off all of these bubbles from on top. A technique taught to me by a friend and coffee enthusiast, who, once these drippers are finished, I'd like to make another video featuring these of us testing them and seeing how things like the size of the hole in the bottom of the dripper and the angles of the wall affect the end result. Let me know if that is something you'd like to see. But for now, I'll soldier on with the French press and gear myself up for a bit of throwing and teach myself how to make something I've never tried before. And by teach myself, I mean do some research first. And I remembered, when I started making these, that Joe Thompson of Old Forge Creations has in fact made a wonderful guide on how to make them, links to which I'll leave in the description below. And you should definitely subscribe to his YouTube channel, as he makes brilliant technical videos, as well as creating templates and guides like this, which is exactly what I'm going to use, so I know the height and width I need to throw my drippers to. So thank you, Joe, for doing much of the hard work already. I'll be throwing mine up to where it says 12.5, as that's roughly how much my clay shrinks. But he's made this so it works for both terracotta and porcelain too, as they shrink at different rates. The one thing I will do is make a slightly beefier template. This way I can get it wet or covered in clay, and I won't have to worry about it disintegrating. And to do this I simply cut out a few bits of cardboard, the same size, and then use plastic sellotape wrapped around them to join them all together. I then jot 2 marks where the 12.5% shrinkage rate is, connect them with a line, and that's this really basic tool finished. I'll be inserting this into the opening of the thrown shape. This way the interior shapes will be the right size, whilst allowing me to throw the exterior shape and the base support of these into any sort of form I like. For those of you who don't know how drippers work, you essentially place a coffee filter inside, put the coffee grounds in this, pour not quite boiling water into it, place it on top of a cup, and then let the coffee drip into the mug below. Now, I've personally never really liked the handles on these. I of course understand that it adds a lot of functionality, but visually I've never liked the 2 stacked handles like this. The entire assemblage can be moved around via the handle below, and often the liquid being poured into a dripper isn't quite boiling hot anyway, and it's a longer, slower process, so we aren't working at scalding hot temperatures. So I'm thinking I'll ditch the handle to create an object that I hope looks a bit more interesting. It also has these ridges on the inside, which the filter sits on, allowing space beneath them so the coffee can drip through. And it's this also that I really want to play around with. And I want to preface this, for all you coffee enthusiasts watching, I'm probably going to make some objects that you don't like and that you think are wrong, but that's fine. This is a learning experience for me too, so I will make some with flat interior walls just to see what happens. Some of these might have 1 hole, or 2 holes, or 1 tiny one, or 1 much larger one. This is an experiment, really. I want to make ones that don't work very well, so I can really look at them and understand why. Yet, at the same time, if you do have any good suggestions or advice, I'd love to hear it. Ultimately, my goal is to create an object that's both visually beautiful, sculptural almost, to match a special cup underneath it, whilst of course brewing a cup of coffee that's so delicious that James Hoffman would be proud. Now I'm going to be throwing these on bats. This way, after the shape has been made, I can simply lift them away on these wooden platforms, as trying to lift these sort of delicate objects off the wheelhead with just my hands is a recipe for disaster, I think. So instead I attach one of these MDF rounds onto a pad of clay, dampen a patch, not soak it. This way the lump of clay sticks down firmly against the wood, as if there's too much water underneath the ball of clay, it simply won't stick down. By the way, for these 6 drippers I'm going to make, I'm using between 600 grams and 780 grams. Each one's a bit different and I'll be throwing them accordingly, but essentially I can leave that excess clay in the areas I want to throw and trim more intricate shapes. I begin by throwing a low round puck shape like this, which I then separate into two pieces. The lower section will be the part that sits on top of the cup, supporting it, whereas the clay being collared into the centre will be pulled up into the cone-like shape the filter will sit in. And with this initial piece, I'm really just getting a feel for how the two parts need to be separated, and therefore how much clay to allocate in each. In this instance, I think I left a bit too much material in the base, which means there isn't much material left in the walls, so this will be one of the drippers made with purposefully straight sides. Although I think I've got a good idea about how to create a shape that will retain my aesthetic, whilst also creating a gap between the filter and the ceramic vessel. But I'll show you that in a moment. By the way, I'm not pressing the insert all the way down in this instance, as the internal base is a bit too high, but I'll be able to trim away at that and make it deeper later. The next step is to scrape away much of the slip from the base portion, although the order in which you do this doesn't really matter. Instead, what I want to create is an object that's as free of slip as it can be. Slip is what we call the wetter clay that covers most thrown objects. If left on the vessel, it will remain wetter for longer, which means it will be a longer time before it can be trimmed and finished. So I always try and remove as much as I can before taking the vessel off the wheel. I also, if I'm working with bats, scrape the slip off the MDF. This makes moving around the bats hereafter a bit tidier, as I'm not smearing wet clay all over the place, but it also means that the bat itself will dry out faster, as the last thing you want to do is keep MDF like this wet for a long time, as it will begin to degrade. To attach the bats themselves, I lightly dampen the back, place it onto the leather-hard pad of clay, tap center it, and then shake it back and forth like this. This really fuses it in place, and that shaking, sideways motion is much nicer than simply hammering down on top of the bat using the side of your fist. Fundamentally, these are really simple objects to make, as in a way the clay I'm squeezing in at the moment sort of becomes its own pot that you're almost throwing on a wheel head made of clay. What I mean by this is that once the two components are separated, I won't push down any further through the disc of clay beneath this little pot, as if that part is made too thin, it will be practically useless. From this point, the thicker walls are stretched out taller and wider, and in some of these I want to leave some excess weight in the walls so that I can trim the interior to make a shape that the filter won't simply be able to sit flatly against. If the walls are thick enough, you can actually just push this down into the vessel, but if I don't have to, I'd rather not, especially with walls that are relatively thin. Now, the reason I'm leaving so much excess clay in the bottoms of some of these is so that not only can I create these stepped shapes, like this, giving these pour-overs a bit more personality, but also so that I can trim a locating foot ring on the bottom of each, holding the dripper within the rim of the cup. Or I can do it the other way around and create a footwell that sits around the rim of the cup. I think there's the potential to create some rather interesting objects, especially if paired with a cup specifically for the dripper. That'll be the third step in this process. After these initial pour-overs have been tested and the wrinkles have been ironed out, I'll create some far more intentional sets. The one thing I'd say with these is center your clay properly. Sometimes this is a process that admittedly I sometimes rush. I'll of course center the lump, but I won't do it really well, especially if I'm making very simple mugs and bowls, undulations in the walls of which I can sort of deal with while throwing. Whereas with these, with all the varying components, I want to make sure the lump of clay is centered really well. From this point, the piece of clay is flattened into a disc that's left relatively thick, and I make sure the sides are nice and straight. This way, when I indent the lump of clay at about the halfway point, I'm left with nice smooth edges. Also, as you're pressing the clay in like this, make sure you're doing it with wet fingers or a wet sponge, because as you're applying so much inward force, if either component dries out, the wall of clay or your hand, you'll likely just tear away this top part, leaving you with a rather useless amount of clay to make anything else from. Now, the walls of this piece I want to leave really thick, as the idea is to trim the interior to have a more complex shape, whilst retaining clean, straight walls on the outside. This piece is definitely thrown a bit more thickly, and I like the hefty walls as I can't wait to trim the inside to create a more interesting shape. I have a feeling that these objects are going to be much more annoying to trim as they are to throw, but upon watching this back, I should have spent more time cleaning up the insides on all of these, as these funnel-like shapes direct all the turnings into the centre, making it a real nightmare to tidy up. I know you're told not to trim the insides of pots, but well, I'm well beyond that at this point. I try not to do it for things like mugs and bowls, the pots I make many hundreds of, but for pots which are more of a one-off, which I suppose these sort of are at this stage, then I don't typically mind. But it does irritate me when people complain that my pots are trimmed too much and that the objects I make are no longer handmade enough for them. The answer is simple, really. Just purchase pots from another maker whose work is handmade enough for you. And sorry, that is the wrong word because my pots are entirely handmade. What I mean is that handmade element is still present. Overtly present, I should add, in the form of throwing rings, subtle inconsistencies, and turning marks. The truth is, my pots do still have those. You just have to look a bit more carefully for them, as I don't think they're really the main characteristics of my aesthetic. And one of the things I've always really admired in handmade ceramics are pots that are made to such a high degree that they look as if they could be made by a machine. Yet, lo and behold, they were actually made by a pair of talented hands. I suppose the most important thing to me is making this craft versatile. Any potter, or maker, or collector who thinks there's only one way of doing things, the proper way, well, I think they're the ones in the wrong. The arts and crafts are beautiful because of how varied it is. Rant over. Now, this last throne shape, I think, is the one. Its shape harkens back to some of the bowls I've made in the past, by having a small ledge about halfway up that juts inward ever so slightly, and I'm hoping in the finished object that this line that projects inward will be enough to keep the filter away from the walls underneath it, all whilst remaining as a very simple object. But we'll see. There's going to be a bit of a journey before that can happen, but I should be firing the kiln soon, and these pots will most definitely be packed inside. I suppose my greatest fear at this point is the pots actually slumping and distorting during the reduction firing. Each one of these is going to be trimmed quite extensively, and I just hope the feet I'm going to give them can be supportive enough. But only time will tell, and the next thing I need to do is dry these all very carefully, and flip them over so those thicker bases have ample time to dry out. I left these drippers out and exposed for a couple of hours, just enough for the clay to stiffen up somewhat. The template can just be washed with a sponge to get rid of all the clay stuck to it. Then, towards the end of the day, I just wired each piece off the bat, which, now that these pots have stiffened up a bit, means they don't distort quite so much by dragging a wire underneath them, although actually getting them off the bat was a bit of a challenge. So I braced the wooden bat against a wooden board and very gently twisted the dripper until it came loose. I'll be leaving these out overnight, but I'm also going to be firing my electric kiln, so I will need to cover them carefully, otherwise there's a chance they'd dry out far too much. And I'll leave the drippers this way up, as the absorbent wearboard underneath them should draw out quite a lot of moisture from the bases of them, whereas if I placed the drippers upside down and then slung a sheet of plastic over them, the plastic would lie quite flatly on their bottoms, and they'd probably end up drying out a lot less. It's the following day, and the bases of these are still a bit damp, so I decided to place them on a tea towel on top of the kiln I had just fired, the temperature of which was about 300 degrees at this point, so it radiated a nice amount of heat through the lid, through the towel, and into the bottoms of these pots, drying out those thicker portions of clay. Now, with my limited knowledge, I know that the angle of the wall and the size of the hole make a difference to the extraction of coffee and how it tastes. The smaller the hole or holes pierced into the bottom of these, and the slower the rate at which the coffee can pass through them will be. But this, combined with the size at which you grind your coffee, is vitally important too, as if the coffee is too dense and the hole is too small, the extraction will be far too slow, whereas if the hole is bigger, then the liquid can pass through too quickly, again changing the taste of the end result. Now, the angle of the walls is 60 degrees, as is the angle either side of that. That's exactly why one of the brands of these drippers is called V60. If the shape is taller, there should be more water pressure on top of the coffee, thus pushing it through faster. Whereas with a wider shape, it gives the coffee more time to pass through slowly, perhaps intensifying the taste of the coffee itself, depending on all the other factors, of course. Ultimately, despite being a really simple object, it seems like there are tons of factors that could alter the taste of the coffee at the end. I also imagine the type of water used and the filter itself make a huge difference, adding to the list of variables. It's all getting rather confusing, so let's switch focus back to the trimming of these. This is perhaps the most simple shape I'm going to create. I've smoothed the interior walls and the foot, but most of the work is on the bottom of it. So I slice it off the wheel head, flip it over and secure it in place with 3 lumps of soft clay that are pressed delicately against the rim as not to distort it. I'm going to pierce a small hole in this one, making it a dripper, as the coffee will pass through it incredibly slowly. I'll try to trim the feet of these each a bit differently, but for this one I'm going to turn it flat with a raised foot in the centre that'll locate it in whichever cup it's placed in. And for this task I'm using my really sharp tungsten carbide tools, especially as I begin trimming further out on the overhanging foot, as I think if I was using one of my blunter turning tools and trimming on this outer edge, it could cause the foot to slump down to one side, creating an undulation in this disc of clay. With the foot itself burnished, I pierce a hole in the centre, and for all of these I'm going to have to tidy up the exit wound on the inside, meaning that each one of these will have to be flipped back over, and any burrs of clay or roughness on the exterior shape will be smoothed over and tidied up, as if left they could create some edges that liquid or very fine coffee grounds could cling onto, thus clogging the device. It'll shrink of course to more closely match the cup beneath it, but I like it already, despite this being the simplest of all the shapes. This next piece will be very similar, although I'll be piercing 2 holes in the bottom and of course trimming a more decorative shape on the outside, where you can see those steps. The interior walls themselves actually bow out slightly, and then on the outside I trim them to be flat. Either way, as the walls are unribbed, the filter will likely stick to them a bit closely, but surely the coffee will still have to pass through the holes at the bottom. I have a glass Chemex at home, and the filters often cling pretty badly to that, but it still produces a nice cup. But I think my iterations after this will create subtle ways of creating some separation. After all, how much do you really need? A millimetre? 2 or 3 millimetres? A centimetre? That's got to be too much. Or is the idea simply to create some space where liquid can flow if it needs to? I guess we'll find out in the long run, and I'm also sure I'll be inundated with comments here about it. So far, I quite like this stepped shape. They will be softened slightly as the glaze pools over them. Nonetheless, it will help to create a more visually striking object. Before flipping them onto their rims, I make sure I scrape the wheel head clean, as I don't want the clay here to stick itself back into the rim. I've just spent time carefully finishing. The shape is then lightly tap-centered, and in this instance I'm centering the cone portion beneath, not the disc above it, as I'll be able to turn that back to being true anyway, if there is any movement in it. For this one I've got to turn away more clay from some parts than others, due to the stepped shape on the other side, meaning that this dripper will slot over the rim of the cup, rather than sitting within it. Although I'm not sure how this sort of shape will hold up during the firing, and part of me thinks with all the weight of that cone sitting on one small portion of this platform, it could very well cause this underside to slump inward as the clay reaches top temperature. Which makes me wonder whether I should glaze the undersides of these if I can, provided there's room, or if I should leave them bare, as if I do so I can strategically place small bits of wadding like tiny supports to prevent the underside from potentially sagging inward or collapsing. And as I stamp the underside here, I'm pushing up with a finger underneath it, as otherwise I'm pretty sure the pressure needed to mark the clay would cause this platform to tip over to one side. Next is the dripper thrown with really thick walls and with 3 steps on the outside, and I can already tell you that I'm going to get rid of one of the steps on the bottom, as I think 3 is a bit too much visually. Now on the inside I'm going to trim a sort of scalloped shape, curved grooves really running from bottom to top, the highest points of which will keep the filter just ever so slightly lifted off the walls. And this was absolute hell to do, as all the trimmings just fall into the centre, become compacted and are a nightmare to remove. But the issue is, if I had thrown this shape, then the exterior form of the dripper would have followed suit, having a bumpy texture to it. But I suppose I could have done it sort of the other way around, by initially throwing this fluted shape but with thick walls, and then the excess could have been trimmed away from the outside in. This way I'd only really be trimming the outside, where the turnings obviously just fly off the wheel and into the wheel tray. Visually I quite like this, and I think it will make me want to glaze this piece in a thinner glaze, as I don't want to obliterate these grooves with a really thick, glassy layer of glaze. Eliminating the extra step was easy, as I just pressed the blade down over it, which meant I could also make the cone slightly narrower towards the base, creating a slightly more elegant shape overall. But I think from this point I've got to make some drippers with a larger hole, as my coffee enthusiast friend told me they'd probably be a bit more versatile, and the hole on the V60s themselves are actually rather large, and they must know what they're doing. The other fear I have with some of these, especially those made with more complex shapes, is the forms cracking as they dry, as there's no way I'm going to be able to turn the bases of these to be completely even in cross-section everywhere. They won't be too bad, but there will inevitably be thick spots and thin spots, so my plan is, after these have been trimmed, is to dry them out insanely slowly. I'll wrap them up with plastic sheeting and I'll keep them covered like this for a good long time. But if any of you are potters that happen to make coffee drippers like this, do let me know what your technique is, as I'd love to hear your advice. For the larger holes I can use a turning tool to make them, rather than a hole piercer itself. I find I can be a lot more accurate this way. After making the hole, it allows me to see the thickness of the floor of the pot, and in this case I could see that there was still a bit more clay I could trim away from this central portion. Of course I can't trim too far out, as that would extend into the platform itself, but this small central part is the bit that connects to the cone on the other side. And the useful thing about trimming the feet of these pour-overs or drippers is that I can feel the cross-section almost entirely, meaning it's relatively easy to judge the thickness of the object I'm making. That was one time-consuming dripper to make, hence all the time lapses in this video, otherwise it would probably be close to an hour long in total. I really like the fluted interior on this piece, it adds to the interest of the object, and I can't wait to see how the filter contends with it. The next two drippers are similar in some ways, but the ledge in the funnel section of the dripper is inverted in each. I don't think this piece will work particularly well, as the filter will still sit relatively flush to the lower portion of the dripper, but on the other version I think I might have actually come up with a good idea, as with the ledge the other way round it creates a cavity on the lower half of the dripper, and as a bonus it really matches the rest of the aesthetic of my work, but more on that just after I finish this. Given those I've now made, I think I prefer this inner locating flange, as it does make them more versatile as they'll be able to fit into more cups. I've also left the locating portion relatively thick and sturdy, as it's going to be moved around a lot, taken on and off cups, shoved in cupboards, and so on, and if it was really thin and delicate, it could quite easily chip. I almost ruined this piece though when stamping it, as by pressing in my mark it caused this thinly trimmed section to tip to one side. Thankfully, nothing cracked, but by running a kidney from below and gently teasing it back into place, I was able to fix it. Whilst I'm not sure I like the aesthetic of this piece, I do like its finesse. It's really light and delicate, but I don't think it will work very well. Now, here's the one I'm actually excited about. You can see how the ledge and the waist of this projects inward, and I think this should be enough to keep the filter slightly raised off the surface. The original piece with the ribs on the inside just don't really feel like they match my aesthetic, so I was, in some way, on the search for a shape that would work whilst retaining a minimal aspect to it, and this piece seems to have ticked those boxes. I actually went ahead and made another one of these straight away, but with walls that were a bit more vertical. I think generally I could have done making all of these a fraction taller, but I prefer drippers where the filter does sit slightly raised over the rim, as they're much easier to take out after they've been used. Anyway, here are the 6 that I've made. Of course they're not usable yet, but in the near future, after these have been put through the kilns, I'll be testing each of them out. They're rather interesting shapes, I think, and if they don't work, well, I can just use them as small flower pots. There's a real range of shapes, from how the sides are finished to how the bottoms of each are turned. And like most things, I think learning to make these will take about 3 attempts. This first batch feels a bit rough and ready. I'm sure some of them will work, but honestly, I've got no idea how they'll perform until they've been tested. Thereafter, I'll create a second batch with any improvements, but it will probably take another attempt after that to feel like I've really got the hang of creating them. It's practice, after all. And since making this video, I've also thought of some novel ways of creating ridges on the inside that aren't too time-consuming and also align to my aesthetic. Either way, it was a fun few hours throwing and trimming these, especially since it was an object I'd never made before. In truth, I was quite nervous about producing a video like this, as I know coffee enthusiasts, which I am to some degree, can be quite passionate on their views about which method works best for them, and I'm sure a few of you watching will question some of the forms made, but I'm already doing that myself. Anyhow, thank you so much for taking your time to watch, especially if you've made it all the way to the end. That really means a lot. All that's left now is to wrap these up in plastic so they can very slowly dry out. And, as always, I'll see you next time.